In this lecture, I'll go over all the different snapping tools and snapping options in Blender. With these tools, you can do things like snap objects to the grid, or even snap them to the surfaces of other objects. There's lots of useful and cool stuff in this lecture. And make a note too that these snapping options work in other modes besides object mode as well, like edit mode. So we'll start things off by going up into the snapping menu here in the header of the 3D view. Now by default it's set to increment, which means snapping will be based on the grid's increments, and we brushed on this in the axis and grid lecture in the last section. Let me go into top view. Now when snapping is set to increment, if I press G to move the cube and hold Control, it activates the snapping tool. And you can see movements are based on the size of the increments of the grid. Now because snapping to the grid is based on the size of the grid increments, as we zoom in you can see the grid increments subdivide and become smaller. So when we press G and then hold Control to activate snapping, the movements become smaller as well. And same thing when we move out and the increments become larger, the snapping increments are more spaced out. Now let me zoom out so we have those larger increments, and I'll scale this up like that so we can see it a little bit better. Now when I press G and hold Control for snapping, you can see at the top left corner it's moving in 1 meter increments. We can also hold Shift to subdivide that increment by 10, so now you can see at the top left corner it's moving things by 0.1 increments instead. So holding Control and Shift gives you more precise movements when you are snapping to the grid. That also works when you're not snapping to the grid too. If I press G to move it around, and then I hold Shift, you can see it moves it much more slowly, so we can really fine-tune our movement and get real precise about its placement. Now also keep in mind that snapping works for rotation and scaling as well. For example, if I press R and hold Control for snapping, you can see at the top left corner it's rotating in 5-degree increments. And it works for scaling too. I'll press S, hold Control, and it's scaling things up by exactly 0.1 increments. And holding Shift for those transformations works the same as well. I can press R, hold Control, and then also hold Shift. And now it's going to be rotating in 1-degree increments instead of 5. And that works for scaling too. I'll press S, hold Control and Shift, and now it's scaling up at 0.01 increments. So keep that Shift key in mind because that comes in handy. Now instead of holding Control all the time to activate snapping, we can also enable this magnet icon right here next to the snapping menu. And that's going to make snapping happen automatically anytime we're moving something. So if I press G to move the cube, you can see it's snapping to the grid even though I'm not holding Control. But by default, that's not going to work for rotation or scaling. You can see snapping is not happening with that. But if we go back into the snapping menu here, you can see that we can enable rotate and scale as well. So now when we have the magnet icon enabled, it's going to affect moving, rotating, and scaling. So let's double check. I'll press R to rotate, and it is indeed snapping in 5-degree increments. And scaling is working as well. Let me get that set back to just move though. Now when you're doing a lot of snapping, it makes sense to have the magnet icon enabled, but then once in a while you might be moving an object that you don't want to snap to the grid or anything else. Well, instead of turning off the magnet icon, you can simply hold the Control key while you're moving the object around, and that will disable the magnet icon temporarily until you let go of the Control key again. So that can come in handy. Now by default, snapping works based on the grid's increments, but it doesn't actually snap directly to the grid. Let me show you what I mean. Let's say I move the origin point in the middle. Well, let's turn off snapping real quick. Let's say I move the origin point into the middle of the block right there, right? And now I press G and then hold Control for snapping, and I move it to the right. You can see it moves it to the right, 1 grid increment, but it doesn't actually snap it to the grid. It's just using the grid's increment sizes in order to move the object. Now if we wanted to snap directly to the grid points, we can enable something in this menu here called Absolute Grid Snap. So I'll turn that on, and then I'll press G to move it, and hold Control for snapping, and you can see now it only snaps to the grid points, and nothing in between. So now let's move on to the vertex option right here. So let me click on that to enable it, and let me set something up real quick. I'm going to move this cube up on top of that red line, and from top view I'm going to add a plane there, which I'll scale up, just like that. Alright, let me select the cube, and let me show you how vertex snapping works. So this mode will snap your objects to the vertices of another object, which is pretty obvious. By default, it's set to closest as the target, which means that the point of your selection closest to the target will snap to the target. So for example, if we move this cube to the vertex at the bottom left here, then the closest point of the cube to that target will snap to that target. So in this case, the bottom left of the cube right here will snap to that vertex since that's the closest point. So let me demonstrate. I'll press G to move it, hold Control for snapping, and move it over there. And you can see that little circle pop up showing us where the target's being snapped, or where the object's snapping to the target. And you can see the bottom left part of the cube, which was closest to that target, gets snapped to that target. And same thing when we move it around the corners of the plane here. the points on the cube closest to the target it's snapping to snap to that target. Now the next target option for vertex snapping is called center, and this will snap the transformation center of your selection to the target. Now in order to see the transformation center, let me go up into the viewport gizmos here, and I'll enable the view or the move gizmo here. And that's going to show us wherever the transformation center is. And by transformation center, I mean the pivot point here, which we went over in a previous lecture. Right now it's set to median point, so when we have one object selected, the origin point is the transformation center. So let me press G to move it, and I'll hold Control for snapping, and I'll move it over to that vertex. And you can see the origin point, or the transformation center, gets snapped directly to that target. And I'll do that over whatever vertex we snap it to. Now let me further illustrate exactly what's happening here when we're snapping a transformation center. Let me duplicate this 3 times like that, and let me set the pivot point to active element. So I'll select all 3 of these cubes now, and you can see the transformation center is right here over our active selection. That's because we changed the pivot point to active element. So now when we press G to move the entire selection and hold Control, you can see it's snapping where the transformation center is, no matter which vertex we snap this on. And now let me hold Shift, and I'll select the middle cube there, and this becomes the active selection, so now the transformation center is right over that origin point. Now press G and hold Control for snapping, and now you can see how snapping is working based on that new transformation center. Alright, so let me reset the pivot point, and let's go back into the snapping menu, and we'll change the target to median. Now with median enabled, it's going to snap based on the median point of the selection. So with these 3 cubes here selected, there's the median point right there. So I'll press G and then hold Control for snapping, and you can see snapping is happening based on whatever that median point is. If I select those 2, hold Control for snapping, it's snapping basically in the middle of them, and so on. And now if we set the target to active, it's going to snap based on the active selection, which we actually just saw a minute ago. So right now, the cube on the right here is the active selection, so I'll press G and hold Control, and you can see it snapping to that active selection. If I hold Shift, select the other cube, now this is the active selection, and now that's where snapping is happening. So now let's check out some of the other snapping modes, which are all very similar. Let me go back into the snapping menu, and I'll switch to Edge. And let me select one of these cubes. I'll press G and then hold Control for snapping, and move it close to one of the plane's edges. You can see it's snapping right onto that edge. Now let's switch this to Face, and I'll press G and hold Control for snapping, and you can see it's snapping right on the surface of the plane right there. And both the edge and face options here also have the same target options there. And now let's move on to volume, which also has the same target options here. Now with volume, it's going to snap the object to the middle of something. So let me delete this plane here and add something that actually has some volume. I'll add in a cube, scale it up, and scale it lengthwise. And let me delete the others and just work with one here. So let me go into front view. I'll press G to move the cube around and hold Control until I snap it over this object like that. Now if I rotate the view, you can see it snapped the cube to the middle of that box. So what it's doing basically is finding the distance between the front face here and the back face, and it's placing the cube right in the middle of it. So for example, if we went into side view, press G and held Control to snap it to the object. Now it's finding the distance between the side faces, and it's placing the cube right in the center. And this works at angles too. For example, if we snap it to this area right here, it'll find the distance between this face right there and about this point right here on the back side. So let me show you. I'll press G, hold Control, and snap it right there. So you can see it placed it in the middle of that trajectory right there. And that's basically all there is to it. And in fact, calling it volume is a little bit misleading because this doesn't actually have to be a whole object. For example, if I delete those faces right there and we're left with just the top and bottom faces, if I select the cube, go into top view so that those faces are overlapping, I'll press G and hold Control for snapping, and I'll drop it right there. And you can see it just finds the distance between the 2 faces and it places the cube right in the middle. Now that kind of brings me to the next option, which is called Snap Peel Object. Now I'm honestly not sure about this option. It says that when it's enabled, it then considers the object as whole when finding the volume, but as you just saw, the object doesn't actually need to be whole in order for this to work. It just finds the center between the 2 faces. So I'm just going to skip past this option for right now. Now for this example here, we're going to switch snapping to face, and we're going to change the target to center, and now we're going to go over this cool option called Align Rotation to Target. This is especially useful when the snap mode is set to face, and this now allows us to snap objects to a surface while also rotating the objects to match the surface angle, which can be very useful for placing objects on uneven surfaces like I'm about to demonstrate. So here I've got this cone, and I'm going to press G and hold Control for snapping, and you can see it snapping to the surface. Now if we move it to this angled surface, you can see it's aligning the cone with that surface angle. So this can be very handy when trying to place multiple objects onto an uneven surface and also have them aligned with that surface. Now what's happening is that it's aligning the object's z-axis with the target surface so that the z-axis is pointing away from that surface. So if your objects end up snapping to the surface sideways or upside down, that means your mesh is not aligned right with the object axis. And let me just show you what I mean real quick. I'll go over to the object properties, and under viewport display, I'll enable visibility of the local axis. So there you can see our object's axis with the z-axis pointing up. And you can see that our cone mesh here is aligned perfectly with that z-axis. That's important because it's the z-axis that gets aligned with these surfaces. So if I snap it to the surface there, you can see the z-axis is pointing perfectly away from that surface it snapped to. Now this align rotation to target is also available for vertex and edge snapping as well, but I find it to be most useful for face snapping. Now let me reset the cone back to the start there. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to move that up above the surface. And I'm going to press Shift and D and create many different copies of this. Like that. Now let's say I wanted to snap all of these cones to the surface down here while also rotating all the cones to match the alignment of the surface. I want to do this all in just one snapping motion. The problem is that right now it's treating this entire selection as one object. So when I hold Control to activate snapping, it just moves the entire selection as one block. But when we're in face snapping mode, we have this extra option here called Project Individual Elements. That's going to treat each one of these objects in the selection as its own individual element. So I enabled that, and I'll press numpad 7 for top view, and let me press G, and then hold Control for snapping, and then left click to confirm. And let me rotate the view, and there we go. So it snapped each one of those cones individually to the surfaces below. So in just one operation, we were able to get all those cones on the surface, and we even align them with the surface too. And that's very cool stuff. Project Individual Elements is especially useful in edit mode too, when you want to snap vertices onto other surfaces, but we'll go over edit mode stuff more in the modeling section. Now I just want to mention that all these snapping options actually work for the 3D cursor as well. Now by default, if I hold Shift and right click on a surface, it already snaps the 3D cursor to that surface. You don't have to activate snapping for that. But you can change it to things like vertex or edge. Then you can hold Shift and right click to start dragging the cursor around. Then you can even let go of Shift if you want, and you can keep dragging it around. Then you can hold Control to activate snapping. As you can see, we're snapping to the targets now. And this works with align rotation to target as well. So let me set this to face, and I have align rotation to target enabled. But for this to work, we actually have to disable Project Individual Elements. For some reason that interferes with it. So let me turn that off. Then I'll hold Shift and right click to start dragging. Then hold Control, and you can see we're aligning it and snapping it to the surface now. So if I zoom in and rotate, you can see that it is indeed aligned with that surface. Alright, so that's going to do it for this snapping menu up here, but there is another snapping menu that we'll go over real quick. So let me delete all the objects except one of the cones. Scale that up a little bit. And to access that other snapping menu, we can simply right click on an object, and we have the extra snap menu down here. And these are all pretty simple, so we're going to get through them pretty fast. So let me go into front view, and let's say I had the cone in the middle of one of those grid spaces right there, but I wanted to snap it directly to a grid point. Well, then I can right click and choose Snap Selection to Grid, and it snaps the origin point to the closest grid point. Now if I right click and choose Snap to Selection or Snap Selection to Cursor, it's going to snap it directly to wherever the 3D cursor is. Now the option Selection to Cursor but Keep Offset is when you have multiple objects selected. So if we have two objects like this, and we want to move this selection to the 3D cursor, if we right click and choose simply Selection to Cursor, it places them both there individually. So let me undo that. Let's say I just want to move this selection to center over the 3D cursor. Then you would right click and choose Selection to Cursor, Keep Offset. That keeps these objects at the distance they were from each other, and it just places the center of that selection right where the 3D cursor is. Now let's say I had this plane object right here, and I wanted to snap the cone to the center of this plane, to the origin point of the plane. Well, I'll select the cone, hold Shift, and select the plane there. Then I can right click and choose Snap Selection to Active. That's going to snap whatever object I have selected to whatever the active selection is. So you can see it snap the cone to the center of the plane right there. Alright, so that's going to do it for our selection snapping extra options, but we also have some extra options for snapping the cursor. For example, if we wanted to snap the cursor to whatever we have selected, we can right click and choose Snap Cursor to Selected. It's pretty obvious. And we can right click and choose Snap Cursor to the World Origin, and that'll reset the cursor to the middle of the Blender world. And we can right click and choose Snap Cursor to Grid. And if the cursor is in the middle of a grid increment like that, and we do that, just like we did with the selection, it's going to snap the cursor to whatever the nearest grid point is. And last but not least, if we have multiple objects like that, and we have them all selected, and there's one active selection, we can right click and choose Snap Cursor to the active selection. And so on. That comes in handy more in edit mode. In fact, all of these snapping options also work in edit mode. Now, as of version 2.82, there's been some additions to the snapping menu up in the header here, which I'll go over now. The first addition is this new back face culling option, which won't allow snapping to the back side of faces. Every face has two sides, an outside and an inside, and we'll go over this stuff more in the next section when we go over normals. But for now, you just need to know that you can limit snapping to the outside of a face. In this example, the top of this plane's faces is the front or outside of the faces, and the bottom of the faces is the back or inside. Now I've got face snapping set up already, so for regular snapping, I can simply move one of these cones and hold the control key, and it's going to snap to the surface perfectly like that. And we can do that from either side of the faces. So if I do it from the underside here, I'll press G and hold control, you can see it still snaps to the surface, no matter which side of the face I'm on. Now if there's a circumstance where the inside of the faces is obstructing the process, we can turn on back face culling. So I'll go up into the snapping menu, turn on back face culling. Now if I select another cone, and I press G from this side, and I hold control for snapping, you can see that it doesn't work. You'll have to go around to the top side of the face, press G, hold control, and now snapping works. And that new option was added for every one of these modes except increment. Alright, and next up, in the snapping menu here we have two new snapping types, edge center and edge perpendicular. So I'll enable edge center, I'll select this last cone here, press G and hold control, and you can see it's just going to snap it to the center of any edge that you hover over. And then the next snapping type is edge perpendicular, which is going to snap the selection to the closest edge or vertex in a perpendicular fashion. For example, if I press G and hold control, it's not snapping on anything here, but it'll snap right there. And you can see the guideline there showing us that nice straight edge. And we can also snap it down here or over here. So that'll just give you some nice perpendicular or straight snapping. And now finally, I want to go over one more cool tool with snapping. Let me set this back to face. I'll select this cone there. And for this to work, we need to enable the magnet here. This won't work by simply holding control for snapping. So let's enable the magnet for automatic snapping. Then I'll press G. And while it's snapping along the plane here, I can press the A key to throw down some user-defined snapping points, and it's going to snap our object there to the average center of all those points, which I think is really cool. And then when you're done, you just press enter, and it drops the cone in the middle of all those self-defined snapping points. Alright, so that's pretty much it. There's lots and lots of snapping options, right? And a lot of them are actually frequently used too, so this is a good lecture to watch a couple of times and practice with. But we'll also be using snapping options throughout the course, and we'll make sure you know what we're doing when we use them. But that'll do it for this lecture, so I'll see you in the next one.